Hello. So we're back again. This is the third part of the Andre's nonlinear digital class systems to, I forget the exact name. I think I wrote something different in each single one of these stream titles. But the first one we covered vSynth, the second one we covered Hydra, and the third one we're going to cover video waves. So what is video waves? Video waves is a program I wrote. It's built around open frameworks and GLSL. The way you get it and you set it up is you go on over to my GitHub page, and you can find this on Video Waves or Little Waves. Either one of these repos. The current edition is the square root of pi, which is around 1.77 something something. But I'm working on 2.0, which should be ready for by the end of March. To install, if you have no idea what Open Frameworks is or any of this stuff means, you just ignore all the GitHubsy bits, go down to the README, and you want to grab one of these drive folders here, depending on whether you're running OS X or Windows. And just follow the instructions in there. I've already done a bunch of videos on the installs of this, so I'm not going to include that in the live stream. And I'm just going to assume you already have this. If you don't have it right now, you can watch, and it might be still fun and entertaining. But this will be saved, and we'll say it up because I guess the audio and the video quality is pretty decent. So once you get to this point where you've got this thing running, what you should see pop up is this little thing here, which has your camera zones outputting on here, and this little GUI chunk over here. So what is Video Waves? Video Waves is basically a system for mixing camera inputs with feedback. So previously in the vSynth section, we weren't really able to do like straight up like video feedback like this. You can, there's a frame buffer built in there. I'm not going to go into that too much now. But we were just doing signal feedback. So we were taking signals and feeding them back into each other and getting some pretty crazy stuff. But then once we dug into Hydra, we had the capability to easily take the output of the screen and feed it into the input of the screen using some just additive linear interpolation stuff. And we were getting all kinds of crazy colors and shapes happening here. But Hydra and vSynth, they're both larger scale things. They're both very much like video synthesis environments where you can do all sorts of stuff. Video Waves, this thing that I wrote, does much less. It really just allows you to screw around with feedback, but it does so in a very optimized way, because one of the things about playing with video feedback is that a lot of stuff that you want to do in regular video processing works really quite bad when you try to like do feedback with it, and a lot of things that looks really awesome and fun when you play with feedback doesn't really do anything when you're working with just straight up what do you call it, when you're just working with non-feedback systems. So it's kind of nice to have something that just does that. So what I'm going to do here is I open up this thing here, which say FB none, and I'm going to go down to FB key. And I'm going to go down to FB0 mix things. I'm going to start playing around with the key values. So what key means is luma key. Luma keying in video means you just take like a brightness value and remove that from a thing. So what I'm doing is everything under a certain brightness value in my camera input is being replaced with a delayed copy of the input. Now, this isn't just a regular old delayed copy of the input. This is a feedback delay, meaning that it gets the output is being fed back into the input. So that's why everything is freezing on the screen. As I do this, it's saving all of my movements and just freezing them. Because this is digital feedback and not analog camera feedback, there's no analog things happening in the chain. It's just the only feedback thing is really just like buffers being like buffers and pointers being swapped. So nothing's really changing at all. But once I start doing anything, Oh yeah, while we're on this, key V, key T. Don't want to go into too much detail on all of this because the GUI is going to be changing drastically for the next version. But so key V and key T, let's just ignore that. But Fbo Delay Amount, this is how many frames back you go. So if you increase this to like 25, you can see what's happening is that it's looking back 25 frames in the past. This is running at 30 frames per second. So let's just go back a full second. Go up to 30 here. And what it's doing is taking 1 second of the camera input, holding it in a buffer, and feeding it back. So it's going to do a lot of like crazy awesome looping things. Anything you do in the space of a second gets looped through, fed into this, and fed back into itself. So all of this motion. But it's not just the motion from this. Anything you change. So if I change this mix amount, what it's going to do is all of those changes will be fed into this as well. I might have to do a little bit more increased motion, but you can see all of the changes that I did, all of the parameters that I moved around in that 1 second thing are getting fed back into it as well. So that's one way to gain some sort of intuition onto what's happening here. We go back and slow down the delay. So if I take this back to 0, that just means it's grabbing the last frame and feeding it back into itself. And if I turn all of the keying off for a moment, there's another way you can blend things in, which is this mix amount thing, which is just linear interpolation. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. It's just like a wipe. It's like a dissolve, the standard method of like saying of in video narrative, the standard method of being like, I wonder what it's like if I fade completely into digital feedback, and then I fade completely into digital feedback. Wow. If you know what linear interpolation means, you know that you'd really only expect to get values from 0 to 1. But I set this to go from -5 to 5 because as you may have already understood from what I've been previously doing, I like to go way out of bounds and mess around with like what what the low level things are doing. So when you go negative, it gets this sort of crazy strobing thing happening. And the reason that you get this sort of crazy strobing thing happen has to do with how reaction diffusion works, which is beyond the scope of this class, but it'll be well within the scope of my next class, which will be on cellular automata, reaction diffusion, and feedback systems in general. But yeah, so some basics of mixing things. Let's go back and set this mix back to 0, key things back in. And then let's change some more stuff and see what happens. So over on the other side here, there's a bunch of little folders. FB0 ops is what we want to play with next. So there's these things that say HueX, SatX, and BrightX. You know, I'm really not great at GUI design. It just happens. So it's pretty confusing, but if you just modulate them a little bit, like change these sliders, you can start to see that if we attenuate the hue very slightly, attenuate the saturation very slightly, and the brightness very slightly, this is going to do weird, crazy rainbow trails in the frame buffer. And then if we take this down a bit, it fades out. So
with which parameters are you playing with?
Hue, saturation, and brightness.
Yes.
So the other things we were working in, VSynth and Hydra, we were just working in RGB, and we were talking about how there's some sort of intuitional things that you have on how color spaces work that you have to re-educate yourself on when you're working in RGB. And I never really wanted to do that because I'm easily confused. So I just do everything in HSB space because hue, saturation, and brightness seems to be, at least for feedback systems and also just for me designing things, seems to work better in terms of how it operates. I think it might have something to do with the fact that we have hue, saturation, and brightness as a color space, because it seems to reflect more accurately our perception. RGB reflects, to a certain extent, how our actual eyes work with rods and cones. But we're not working when, like, our consciousness isn't working directly from rods and cones. What our consciousness is working from is this sort of perceptual, the psycho-visual aspect of things, which seems to be processed in HSB space. It's of course not like a one-to-one, but you work with what you can get. So, oh yeah, you can do things like displace this in space too. So what happens if I take this X displace and do that? So if I set these back all to their defaults, that's not right. And just displace this in space. This is basically doing the same thing that scroll X was doing in Hydra. We're just moving it over a little bit, but it's moving it over very slightly, and it's got this very like smooth trailing effect. If we go all the way out to like 100, then you see there's like, this is like straight up like a video delay, like where it's sort of like you can see distinctive things happening in the copies. But as we move this closer and closer, make the displacement smaller and smaller, there's a certain threshold below where you stop seeing individual copies and you just see feedback happening. And if I increase the saturation a bit and I just change the hue slightly, then we'll start to get some hue cycling happening. And you can see it doesn't take very long. As I move, you see copies of the camera input, and they sort of melt into the feedback thing. And we can see this more strongly if I take the delay up to like 15. And then as I move, you see there's a copy of my face, but every time it moves, the hue is being attenuated slightly. It's being attenuated negatively, which is in some people's preferred terminology called, what is it? Attenuversion? I don't know if it's helpful or not to think about things like that, but it exists. Yeah, so most of the time when you're working with feedback systems, if you work with video feedback, there's two sort of intros that most people have, which is either taking a camera and pointing it at a screen like that, or if you have like an SD video mixer, like one of those. Oh, that's very helpful. Trust me, I'm pointing it at an SD video mixer. You can plug the output of those into the input, and the time-based corrector and or frame synchronizer on them will do this sort of thing. But in those systems, you have very little control over time, like how much time happens in between things. And the nice thing about this system is you have absurd amounts of control over the time. So usually when you're working with those sorts of video systems, you're talking about like delays of like milliseconds. Maybe if you have like a mixer like one of these, that probably works with a delay of like, it's not quite a second, but it's close because it's so digital. But over here, I can go up to 2 seconds of delay, and you can like watch the feedback sort of form and very, very slowly. Let's see. So you can play with X, you can play with Y, you can play with Z. Let's speed everything up. So that's pretty dank. You can rotate as well. So that's how you get some sort of slightly kaleidoscopy kind of things. The one I'm playing with here, this is Little Waves. This is just a tiny little intro version to the whole thing. So this only has 2 taps you can go in. It's a 2-tap delay. It just means it's... if you think about it in terms of audio delays, it's how many taps you have into the pass to bring back in and mix in with it. So let's look at and see what happens when we tap in another delay at the end of the chain. So let's take this in. Let's just blend it, and we'll mix it at about like 60 60% here. You notice what this is doing is just kind of slowing down the overall movement of everything that's happening. And if I go back up to this one and I change the delay amount back to like 15 or so, sort of smoothing and wiping everything over. Let's do a lot more drastic things over here. This back to 0. And then just try modulating the speed. So that's pretty cool. Is there anything else I should be going into? Any suggestions? Any questions? Is anything I'm saying making any sense at all?
It's making many sense. I want you to repeat the last part of the taps of the delays that you can only have two. This
one has 2 taps into the delay. Do I have my paper?
There was.
So, delay taps. You think about a delay like that.
It doesn't. Too much light.
Too much light?
Yes.
That's a little better.
That's good.
So, in audio delays, this is pretty much like how like an audio tape delay works, where it's not like segmented off like this, but you say this is like where you feed it in. This is where your output goes, and it just kind of keeps going around in this circular tape thing. And what a tap means, so this is your in. A tap means where you take an out and mix it in with your output. That's an ear. So when you have multi-tap delays, it means you can take multiple outputs and then mix them together here before it gets into your ear. So this is a video delay. Wow, that's really bad quality. I apologize. So instead of audio samples being in here, each one of these things is a full frame. So one frame that is drawn to the output gets stored in this buffer here. So multiple taps means you can select like the delay amount. Yeah, you need to. I would need to fix the white balance on that probably. It's set to auto right now. Mm-hmm. But I set it for different lighting, so don't worry about it right now. I'll just tilt it like this. Multiple taps means that when you go into Fbo delay amount or delay amount on any of them, the number refers to where you're looking at this array here. So 0 frames is the last frame. So if I grab one that's 0 frames, that's the tap there. And if I grab one that's 5 frames, that's the tap there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, so some neat things you can do with multiple taps. So we set this one back to 0. And we set this one where it's like mixing negatively again. So if I do it like that, it's a little harsh and strobing. And maybe I don't want so much strobing. So I can tap into this another delay and just use this sort of as a filter. So as I increase the amount of another delay tap in there, it smooths and slows everything down. What this is really just doing is just like whenever you average something with your past frame, that's just like a pretty standard method of like if you're doing any sort of time interpolation or any sort of like smoothing, it works as a filter. Like it's like a temporal filter. Another thing you can do is let's make sure we're keying in a bit here, and then we can key into a different part of it over here. So by using different keys, and then you can affect different spatialization things. So I can have this displace going in a different direction than the first displace. So we have multiple fields of like movement here. What else? if I turn this back to a 0 mix, turn this one back to a 0 mix. So all we're doing is the 2 weird keys. So you can see each one of these keys is, well, this key isn't really set up properly. If I put this down here, put that up there, maybe turn this one around a bit. Yeah, there's a reason I changed this GUI, is because it was even confusing for me to use. Oh, wait. Go into the lights up here. And then if I go into the darks over here, well. I have nobody to blame but myself for this not working very well. Some other stuff you can do is, you can see what happens when, let's turn all of this one off again, just to blend. And let's try just inverting the brightness. Nope, this one. There we go. So that's really stroby. And you can kind of control this. Let me desaturate the whole thing so you can kind of see more what's happening. So inverting the brightness is just very similar to the way that that negative mix thing was working. It's going to give you these sort of reaction diffusion patterns. This means there's something being fed in and something being killed. There's sort of like a little bit of like a tension happening in each iteration. If we slow it down, you can see it more discreetly. You can see every other frame, we're swapping, we're flipping, not polarizing. We're flipping the brightness values. So as you do it really slowly, it's just like that sort of a copy thing. But as it speeds up and as it gets fed back into itself, it makes these sorts of like complicated worm patterns. And the more that you mess around with like the physical displacement of things, the more complex patterns you get. Little button over here that says toroid, you turn that off. Turning this on and off is like turning on and off. If you've ever played old style video games like Pac-Man, Pac-Man exists in a toroidal universe. Many old video games exist in a toroidal universe. What that means is that when you go off of this side of the screen, you come back over on this side of the screen. When you go off this side of the screen, you come back over on this side of the screen. What a toroidal universe means in this is that, let's see, let's displace things absurdly large, means these copies are going from here, 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 and then as they go over here, they wrap around. See that? Which, if you completely want to key out all of your input, wah, wah, which apparently I can't do. It means it'll just do like pure feedback zones, and you can let things just sort of like run on their own without needing to like give it any more input. So I've got no more input right now. This is just doing some weird, crazy strobing fractal things. So whenever you're feeling a bit upset with strobing, you can always mix another delay buffer in, and it'll smooth things out a bit. There we go. Maybe I want to go over there and like equalize things a bit on HSB. Maybe I just want to add some of that coming down a bit too. There we go. So, like I said, this is a lot. You can do a lot less overall in terms of like the global video synthesis world than in the previous 2 programs. But if you goof around a bunch, you can get some similar things. So one sort of way to get like something like a video oscillator in this is to have toroidal universes turned on and just displace like X and Y values a lot. You can see it's quite far from like a very rigid oscillator. but it is oscillating in a very similar manner. But as you move these around, you get weird blobby shapes. So what these are, you can see these are like magnified versions of this, like the very fine scale wormy things you're getting when you haha, my keyboard is dying. Goodness gracious. So if we turn all of the displacement off, then that's just noise. And then as we slowly start to increase displacement, see little reaction diffusion worms popping up. Beautiful. And then as we increase displacement gigantically, you get big worms. These three here, these three controls are very, very chaotic and complicated. What they are is actually an application of the logistic map bifurcations into the hue of this system, which is also beyond the scope of this class, but well within the scope of the next one. But what it means is that you can use these controls to have different patterns within the hue functionally. So, and they all sort of, these are all in one chaotic system here. So different settings of all three of these means different things. What else can you do with this? Oh yeah, you can do some pretty cheesy kaleidoscope things by turning on all your mirrors. And then you got some classic psychedelic kaleidoscope nonsense. And that's pretty fun to do with rotate as well.
Oh.
Any questions about this?
You can also siphon in, yeah.
Yeah, you can use Siphon on this, and then on the Windows version that I'm finishing up, you'll be able to use Spout as well. Feel like just mentioning that Siphon exists, it's available as a source over here. So it's default just set to grab in whatever siphoner is grabbing. There's a lot of video tutorials where you can look at where I go into much more detail. I just kind of want to do the very broad overview stuff because we don't have a lot of time. But yeah, otherwise, I'm feeling a bit exhausted from doing this as a live stream and from talking more or less constantly for
3 hours.
For 3 hours. So I'm more than willing to wrap up early if nobody has any questions.
Definitely. Thank you.
I
Awesome.
have installation questions, but
Installation questions? Yeah, beyond the scope. And I'll help you out with that later. Okay. Thanks a bunch for tuning in. Please donate for this, because if you donate, then I'll make a lot more of these. So cool.
I really love that. What's on the screen right now?
Mm.